So Patrick and I are beginning to make a habit of this. We were on stage last week at the Masters of Scale Summit, and we thought we would open this up. For those of you who didn't see last week's Masters of Scale Summit, Patrick, who is a Master of Scale, identified himself as a Hamster of Scale. So,
well, okay, for context, you're like, why is there a hamster here? I do think there's this thing, I mean, I guess it serves as good an introduction as anything. I think there's a thing that this thing that happens where, I don't know, I guess we conflate the size of the company with having figured things out. And I don't know Laszlo Bach from Google, who ran HR and people there for a long time. And I'm sure he's a wonderful guy. Again, I don't know him. But I was very struck by the book that he wrote about Google culture, which I haven't read, and maybe a wonderful book. But
well, you were struck by it physically?
Right. Well, it's just like, I mean, it's a book. I think the conceit of the book is like how to have a culture as good as Google, right?
Yes.
My kind of outside view on that is like step one to have a culture as good as Google is like, number one, have the business model that's the best business model in the world and as good as Google. It's like, it really becomes much easier to have a good culture when you have the world's best business model. In a sort of similar vein, I think Stripe has been fortunate to be hauled and thrust along by all these like structural forces. But I do not feel I'm much more comfortable being denoted a hamster of scale than any kind of anything beyond that.
It's one of the key things to always think about, and so. Let's go to the deep heart of what it is to be a entrepreneur, kind of right now, which is this is wars, pandemics, markets. Oh my, after a 10+ bull year market, all of a sudden we're in turbulent times. So the turbulent times is not just questions around what does capital fundraise look like, but what does your customer flow look like? What are you seeing in Stripe, and what's the advice you would give entrepreneurs, kind of in these choppy waters? We're starting with the real stuff.
Okay. Well, I suppose the simple thing today, just from a Stripe vantage point, is I think rates have changed substantially, and as a consequence, I guess investor behavior has changed a lot. Based on what we see in consumer spending and even business spending, that has not yet noticeably changed. Now, maybe there were kind of there are modeling effects where we thought that the pandemic pull forward was actually like some kind of structural new normal, and it turns out that actually no, it is better modeled as a pull forward. But all the headlines you read about Europe, you're wondering like, is there still an economy there? But not only is it still standing, I'm a European, so fortunately but not only still standing, but still growing, right? And so just kind of as kind of a basic foundational matter, the economy seems to be in relatively good shape. From a we've this turn of phrase at Stripe. We want to be micro pessimists and macro optimists, and over the years we're always trying to find ways to sort of inculcate that. For example, when we were moving offices, I told John that I wanted to get kind of signs from other companies that we could put up around the office, like National Semiconductor or Atari or Osborne Computer, or Sun Microsystems or SGI and so on.
This might be an old enough group that they actually recognize those names.
Well, just like, Silicon Valley is famous for being, such a productive and prodigious cradle for new technology companies, whereas, in reality, it's the world's most densely populated graveyard. And I think there's something so kind of gloriously macabre about the fact that, the Facebook headquarters is not the Facebook headquarters, it's the Sun headquarters, right? The Googleplex is not the Googleplex, it's the SGI-plex. We're like crabs just scuttling along and sneaking into each other's shells. But the millennials and the Gen Zs, obviously don't know that. And so, we were all trying to find these structural things that we could do. John didn't let me do the sign thing. He told me that I fundamentally misunderstood how to motivate humans. But we're trying to do things like this. And so, on the one hand, I think for many of the companies that are trading in public markets, and perhaps that's some folks here, I can't speak to that. Stripe is not public. I think it's super hard, and I don't want to sound oblivious to that. But when I look on a 5 to 10 year time horizon, it seems to me that that the really great that the Valley built over the last 40 years went through these cycles. Like, Andy Grove's famous literature was written after and about these melding periods. And so, again, I don't want to sound like some wizened expert here. Stripe is going through this right now. But if I disassociate myself from Stripe and just kind of think as an observer sitting in 2032, I suspect that on average, this is very good for the Silicon Valley ecosystem.
I actually agree, because it's actually partially the refocusing, the question about how to navigate both difficult times and as well as the bull times is actually, in fact, and if you can actually turn it to a strength, you get much more competitive differentiation for doing it. So let's dig a little bit more on...
well, and you're forced to prioritize more, right?
Yes.
Look, even I'm being forced to prioritize more, and it's terrible. In capital abundant times, in I guess theater, it's you want a kind of a yes and culture. Well, when capital is abundant, your product development can also be a yes and culture. Maybe to some extent that's good because you get to kind of have some expansive ambition. But even because our customers are on average presumably going to be investing less over the next 2 years than say they were before. Stripe is some kind of overall averaging of that. We're thinking harder about, well, how do we make sure that we're appropriately calibrating what we're doing relative to them, and we're making harder product trade-offs than we had to 3 years ago.
Well, and I actually think that's embedded in what you're saying is you want to keep the same level of ambition, but it has to be through a focused aperture, rather than, okay, yes, we can do that too, and we can do that too, and we can do that too. Everything from Microsoft all the way down to the Series A has to get more focused.
I think that's true, and I think there's something about, so I started Stripe with my brother John, and John reads earnings transcripts in bed. We used to be roommates, and then we got girlfriends, and it was weird and all that. So, but for the first, and
a wife now. But
yes.
yes.
And now a wife, yes. For the first 8 years of Stripe, we lived together. I'd be shuffling along to brush my teeth or whatever, and he'd be yelling out, "You'll never believe what they said in this 10Q." I always, I as a teenager was really into programming languages and Lisp and all this kind of crazy stuff, but sort of at least aspired to being some kind of technologist. John was always super interested in business, I was early in Stripe's history. I pitched John on, well, we should just make Stripe free because we'd grow much faster. John's like, interesting. Can you explain the business model embodied in that to me? And didn't really have one. But I from a technologist, from the standpoint of purity, I thought that was much more compelling. Anyway, the thing that I think there is some kind of yin and yang, where I suspect most people in this room self-identify more as a technologist than a business person. And I think that's fine and good, and Silicon Valley is ultimately an ecosystem of technologists. Like, we're not New York, but I've certainly found over the years, and I've experienced it kind of myself, that I think it's very easy to become excessively technologist, and I think part of what's the difference between Steve Jobs 1 and Steve Jobs 2? I mean, you can kind of read that many ways, but I think Steve Jobs 2 was much more a business person than sort of the first iteration, and so maybe part of it's the need to focus and all the rest, but I think part of what lots of companies, and again, I include Stripe in this, is kind of the shift that we're having to go through is to not just acknowledge that kind of reluctantly, oh, okay, fine, we're businesses, I guess. It's like to embrace the fact that we're businesses and to think about things like hurdle rates and IRRs and all the rest as part of the fundamental raison d'etre.
Yes, although it maybe less IRRs and more the question of, similar to how we do compounding loops and growth curves and other things, is also the compounding loops in economics, right? It's how the model comes together.
For sure, and yes. yes. And actually, there's a book, some of you probably have read it. It's kind of famous in some small little sort of factions. The Outsiders. Okay, so I'm seeing some nods and smiles. Yeah, I mean, basically, you realize you can nerd out about, data pipelines and the optimal way to do, I don't know, iterative data computation thing. You can nerd out about like the optimal way to be thinking about return profiles, and The Outsiders is, I think, the best single distillation of this.
Yeah. So, and speaking of nerding out, we'll come back to why Lisp was the language that you selected in the things, but
It's the best one.
okay. Speaking of, we'll put the nerd out on the side. Micro-pessimism, macro-optimism. How does that cash out some? Like, what are some of the ways that you operate culturally, make decisions, plan for both ambition and downside? What's some of the way that cashes out?
The structural thing that the tension I was trying to navigate is, I think there was just like a fundamental contradiction in the startup mindset and this cognitive dissonance, where on the one hand, you have to be incredibly attentive to your problems, right? And to recognize the myriad ways in which your product totally sucks, right? And if you're oblivious to that, if you're kind of just cheerfully whistling along, kind of Lego movie style, everything is awesome. I haven't actually seen the Lego movie, but I heard that reference once. If you're,
just like the book for
exactly, yes, yeah. But if you're oblivious to this stuff, obviously reality is going to kind of give you a rude slap in the face pretty quickly. I think the challenge and the tension is, if we're kind of rubbing our own and kind of each other's, faces in this, it's easy to become kind of to have that, I don't know, drag on your spirits, right? And you simultaneously need to have this attitude that, okay, everything is terrible today, but we really have conviction that we can make it fantastic in 2 years' time, in 4 years' time, in 6 years' time. And so this kind of micro-pessimism, macro-optimism, part of what we're trying to do is to give people kind of structure, is to acknowledge this tension and to give people structural permission to be extremely critical of that which exists today, because I think otherwise people feel a bit tentative, like, I don't know, are they criticizing my baby? Can they say that like our dashboard sucks, or this API sucks, or whatever the case might be.
So shifting a little bit of our focus out some, one point you said the internet is like the world's most vibrant city, and the equilibrium has yet to be reached. Where are we on the evolution of the internet? Are we still very early days? Are there places where we need to be making corrections?
I think so. At our event last week at Hamsters of Scale, Reid asked,
we're going to rename it Hamsters of Scale. You heard it here first.
Reid asked, about technologies I'm excited about, and obviously there's blockchain and drones and AI and IoT and all the things. And I said one of the things I'm really optimistic about, and that we see burgeoning around us, is vertical SaaS.
This is the right audience for that comment.
I'm seeing at least one nod there. Great. So, like every sector of the economy, not every single, but essentially every sector of the economy is still fundamentally analog, bespoke, handcrafted, and like not in the nice kind of attractive handcrafted sense, but just like in the horrendously inefficient sense. And all the tools that we benefit from, in kind of how we do business, I think 97% of the rest of the economy has yet to benefit from. We did this video with this company back in Ireland last week. They're called HerdWatch. And it's literally SaaS software for farmers to manage their herds. And certainly today, before HerdWatch and the likes, the cows are, they're not being tracked in Google Sheets, and they're, the cows are not on Slack. But there's just like tremendous efficiency gains, and not just in the logistics of the farm, but like how you do market making and matching and price discovery, and like actually quite fundamental things. There's Farm Logs, which is another company some of you might be familiar with. They do sort of analysis of crops and optimal distribution and pesticide use and trying to lower that and everything else, which is both healthy and cheaper. And it actually, it turns out if you get into this, there's like a whole burgeoning ag tech sector, and so many different ways in which software can be brought to bear. But again, we're at a very early point in this kind of distribution, Carlota Perez sigmoid. So I don't quite know how to quantify it, but if I had to just offer a point estimate off the top of my head, and again, based on what we see from our customers and all the different platforms we're going out trying to serve this, I think we're still in the single digits, right? Because it's it's all the different sectors in the U.S., but then of course it's not just the U.S. or Western Europe. You have to take stock of the full global extent of that, and so on a truly global basis, I think we're barely off the starting blocks. So yeah, I'm whatever. The fact that Jerome Powell, correctly presumably, is running the Paul Volcker playbook, I think should not in any way diminish our optimism about the 5 to 50-year prospects of the technologies being worked on.
Yeah, no, I think that embodies the micro pessimist, macro optimist point from before.
But just like on that, and look, again, I don't. I feel like maybe I was too cavalier earlier. Like, I do not speak with any wisdom. So just consider every answer, in fact, caveat with that. But especially in this one, like Stripe started in 2010, and exactly has benefited from the longest bull market in post-war U.S. economic history, right? And so, we Stripe have not lived through hard times. But certainly from all the people I've spoken with, all the reading I've done, and just trying to get some sense for what might loom in our futures, I think that. We once hired someone from Amazon who was describing how after he started at Amazon, the stock plummeted by 70%. I'm like, oh, that must have been very painful. It was like, actually, no, I could deal with that. What was very painful is when it then fell another 80%. That's when I started to feel bad. And that was Amazon, right? And obviously these, these moments in these companies' histories don't tend to garner, as much attention when the kind of ex post facto, Bradstone books and so forth are written. And so, much in all, as I'm extremely optimistic, I think that you've lived through them, I have not, but my sense is these cycles can be pretty intense.
They're super intense, and one of the things that I think is important to recognize is that it's hitting everybody, and so your differential ability to swim through it, whether it's Amazon, PayPal, other things, is actually in fact the thing that gives you strength. I'm going to ask one more question and then open it up to the audience, just to give some breadth. So Patrick is comfortable expositing the hamster view on a wide variety of subjects, which is good. So progress studies. Why did you do the Atlantic article? What's the key thing? We just had a dinner on this earlier this week. What's the lens of why this is important? Because this is a room of people that will agree with progress studies, but just may not be familiar with it.
Well, I think I suspect everyone in this room is united in the belief that progress, and by progress I mean just the overall broad, society-wide betterment that we've all been beneficiaries of over the last, at this point, several centuries, that it's possible, and that it's important, and that it's contingent, right? I mean, if you thought that we were just on some neat escalator ride to success, I mean, probably there'd be no need to start a company, so someone else would do it. And so I think the kind of intrinsic, irreducible necessity of, human action and agency. And I found, in Ireland, where I grew up, I think this was actually people were very culturally aware of this, because as recently as 1960, Ireland was a destitute, autarkic, insular Catholic theocracy. And my parents remember getting electricity and grew up in subsistence farms and all the things, like the big literature about Ireland being the sick man of Europe and what's going on and so forth. And Ireland, basically, Ireland had bad ideas. We thought that being kind of closed off and walled off from other economies was a good idea. We thought that excluding women from the workforce was a good idea. We thought that having the Catholic Church run our country was a good idea. There were lots of things, right? And then a couple of people made the case successfully, that things should be changed, and Ireland had this explosive growth over the course of essentially my childhood, where it was just kind of starting around maybe 1985, and then it kind of reached the peak, I guess, post the financial crisis pre around 2008. So I grew up in the midst of this, but as a result of that, the kind of sociology in Ireland was everyone really knew that it sucked to not have the right kind of development ideas, and that things can be so much better when you get the circumstances configured the right way. And then I came to the US, and I guess the US has been a beneficiary and kind of rich and developed for so long that there seems to be more of some kind of shrug, right? And maybe even the opposite, where you worry about too much development or too much growth or what have you. And so I think this is. We're not at the end of history yet. We have not developed all the ideas we need. We have not cured most human disease. We have not solved climate change. We have mental health. There's lots of problems. And so trying to find some common hashtag that could generalize beyond just, say, we should have more startups. Like, what's the unifying sentiment there that's more expensive? And so we just wrote an article where we're trying to propose a label for that.
Yeah. And I recommend it. I myself sometimes say, yes, I'm a progressive. I believe in progress. Other questions? All right, I will go with one while you're thinking. Which of the, other than vertical SaaS, which of the technologies do you think is most underrated in the way that it's going to have an impact that entrepreneurs in the room should be thinking about?
Definitely AI.
And say a little bit more.
I've actually been an AI pessimist up to now, where, what's the difference between AI and ML is a bit of the sort of the kind of continuous redefinition where, ML is the stuff that is actually useful, AI is the stuff that's not useful, and so it's kind of tautologically true that AI is not useful. So acknowledging that, but in as much as you think there's kind of something more to this whole thing than good classifiers or whatever, I think that has not really been borne out to date. The aggregate ARR of the AI sector, of all the GPT-3 and other kind of, the DALL-E and other image generation apps and Midjourney and Stable Diffusion and all these things, and summed to all the revenue of the GPT-3 and other LLM users, Jasper and Copy.ai and all those companies. I don't know what the actual aggregate revenue is, but I'm pretty sure it's sub $1 billion, and maybe it's, I don't know, but maybe it's sub $250 million. So just like the market is saying, it hasn't really mattered thus far, right? I think that, there are lots of things that don't matter and are relatively economically inconsequential until suddenly they're not. And it seems to me that we're reaching that tipping point with all of LLMs and various of the sort of image generation, video generation, sound generation, speech transcription, all this stuff together. There was the paper in 2017, Attention is All You Need, from a bunch of folks at Google, bringing into the world the transformer model. And it kind of seems that they might have been right, and that maybe transformers are all you need, and the fruits of scaling them up seem to be super high. And so I think 2023 will be actually the year of AI, and I say that as someone who has been on the substantially skeptical side to date.
I totally agree, but before I ask the next question, I want to see if there's another question here. Okay, great.
Okay, so you have a very unique situation of founding a company with your brother. I'm curious, I think there's a lot of founders in this room, probably many of us have co-founders. I do. Do you think it was easier or harder? And then also you've gone through so many phases and your company's 12 years old. What have you learned in terms of working with other senior leadership and founders that make that kind of a different special relationship and things that you've kind of, that have helped make you successful as a company, as a co-founder group?
Okay, I'll try to give a very attenuated answer because I don't know, you could probably bore someone for hours in talking about all the co-founder dynamics. But so first, building a company is hard, and it's obviously hard in the case where things don't go well. And the thing they don't tell you on TV is it's super hard, or they didn't tell me, is that it's super hard even in the cases where it does go well. There's the Greg LeMond, who I think was a Californian, but the Greg LeMond quote, it doesn't get easier, you just go faster. And one builds companies at the kind of, you hold constant the rate at which you can tolerate problems, and everything else is kind of the variable that moves, and so you're just constantly in this zone of kind of maximum pain, if you're below that threshold, then you take on more stuff, and you get yourself right to that peak, and so given that, I've certainly found it extremely helpful and stabilizing to have someone else who's in exactly the same boat as you, who's been with you through the whole thing, has full context but a different perspective. Just it's otherwise it ends up. I have tremendous admiration for the people who are doing this solo, and look, there are some phenomenal entrepreneurs who are doing it solo. I mean, Mark at Facebook is a perfect example, and evidently, empirically, that can work well, but it seems to me that it would be quite a bit harder. And so I guess my kind of learning from that is I think where they exist, those relationships are precious and worth really kind of investing in and fostering. And then, so the second part of your question. Oh yeah, is it right? So yeah, I mean, I don't know. The big one is it's how do I phrase it? Early on, I think both of us were much more insecure. Not to some crazy extent, but I guess we very much conflated kind of Stripe and our leadership and our own personhood, and those things were all wrapped up together. And I think kind of naturally so, because I mean it was a thing we had just made, right? And so they didn't have kind of particularly separate identities. But I think something that's been very healthy, and that I think if I could speak to 6-year-ago me that I would try to emphasize more, is you are not your leadership style. I now think of myself as, I don't know, like when I go into work, I put on a mech suit, not in terms of offensive capabilities and smiting people,
and not literally,
right? But just in terms of like, if someone said that the mech suit sucks, I would not feel personally attacked. It's just like, oh, I guess that little laser blaster is kind of shitty, and that kind of being able to, I had a conversation with one of our leaders last night, and he gave me a long list of things that he thought I should do better, and I agreed with all of them, and I fully kind of intellectually acknowledged that like such a long list does exist, and I could add more things to it. But I think 6 years ago me would find that a much more uncomfortable experience, whereas now my mindset is much more, he's giving me like excellent upgrade ideas for the mech suit, and so I think, I don't know, that I'd be trying to yell all that to 6 years ago me.
Well, that's an excellent bridge to a question that we are going to be closing many of our sessions with, and so I'm going to ask you that question, which is, if you were to be yelling to your 6-year-ago self, whether it's 5, 7, whatever, what would you most tell yourself about, like, what knowledge would you impart, not with the knowledge of the future, but what would you tell yourself to do differently? More of this, less of that.
I mean, there are lots of specific things, but actually I think the meta one is, that from which most of the others follow, is you are not your leadership style.
But when you say you were not your leadership style, does that mean the fact is you always be learning and seeking to make yourself better and not internalize it, but treat it as an external thing that you're a skill set that you're improving, or
Correct.
yes, okay,
Yeah. And it's like, you're not. What's the right analogy? Mech suit is probably a bad one. Much too
Well, it's the
pugnacious. Yeah. But if trying to think of a good example of something that people do create, but it's not obviously sort of part of their identity, and maybe you could say their code or something. But people do get very possessive with their code. So anyway, I don't know what the right analogy is. But yes, fundamentally that idea that it is it's a well, both it's a separate set of skills, but actually it's also a choice. And I think we kind of fall into these patterns, and again, I include myself, where you find a thing that kind of works, and like now that's you, right? But actually, I mean, it doesn't have to be you. And I've been very lucky where there's other leaders at Stripe who have a kind of maturity to this and I don't know, a sort of a hard-won wisdom that I've learned a lot from, and I've even witnessed their evolution and changes, and that's been there's an implicit gauntlet there where it's like, man, if they can grow and develop that much, like shit, what am I doing? But anyway, all of that kind of bundled together.
Yeah. No, look, I think it's excellent advice, and I actually think one of the things you embody is it's not just your mech suit; it's how are you making improvements in your team's mech suits together. Like how are you playing the sports together? How do you get your role increased, partnering well with them, etc.
Okay, actually, you're all this philosophical mumbo jumbo, not that useful. So my philosophical mumbo jumbo. I mean, so maybe a more tactical, useful prescription is actually when I meet companies like that have product market fit, and I think when a company gets to that stage. Like pre-product market fit, you should be like scrappy and iterative, and just focusing on the product exploration in the space. Once you've product market fit, I think all the kind of lean startup intuitions don't carry over, and you become super focused on building a leadership team. And just like the question is always, who's your leadership team, and how well is it working? And that's a complete inversion from before. So maybe actually 6 year ago me, I would say focus more on your leadership team.
Well, as you can see, why I always love talking with Patrick, and every single event I do, I call him and ask him, hey, will you come on stage with me? So if those of you who were last week Masters of Scale, you saw that. There will be future. Please give him a hand.